Ayukîi kobra nanithvuuy Jason Naa Karuk'áraar Athithúfvuunupma. Hello everyone, my name is Jason Hockaday. I'm from the Karuk tribe and Happy Camp is my village. I am a Ph.D. student in Native American Studies at UC Davis. Being in Davis, I am currently on Patwin homelands, and I'm grateful to be a guest and want to highlight that Patwin people are and have been committed stewards of this land for many centuries, with elders instructing the youth on how to caretake this place for generations, and I am honored to be here. The project that I worked on as a Mellon Public Scholar this summer is about the reclamation of my family's ancestral native song recordings. And so my community partners are my community that is starting with sort of immediate family and then extended family, and then rippling out from there as community members are connected through our various family lines and relations. Some of my hopes for the outcomes of this work, in addition to directly serving my tribal community, is that this project can result in the sharing of Indigenous research methods and designs, for Native American studies as a field, as well as other California Indian tribes as frameworks for addressing colonial histories in the state and around where territories are shared and overlap. And experiences with colonization have been similar. Okay, while we are Karuk, my family's ancestry also includes Kanamahu, which is both an identity and a language, which is related to, or a type of Shasta dialect, and Shasta is also related to Karuk. In 1926, my family's direct ancestor, Grandma Ellen, recorded about 70 Kanamahu songs. And this photo in the presentation slides is our Grandma Ellen. In 2019, I reached out to the Library of Congress, where the recordings are currently housed, and began working with archivists to gather and return the recordings to my family. I recognize that the norm and the expectation is that the community one is working with is really explicitly named, such as in the title or in the description of a project like this. But I think this project is slightly different in that we have a kind of unique political environment where when historically contextualized, the recordings that we're working with don't necessarily fall under the jurisdiction of a contemporary named community with institutional and structural presence to consult. But they could if we decide for that to be the approach we want to take, if we wanted to go through a specific organized and named tribe today, such as Karuk. But they don't inherently, and that's because of histories of dispossession and colonization and conquest, where tribes in Northern California today are comprised of various villages, which are our original units of sovereignty and political governance, and the descendants with rights to these ancestral recordings belong to many communities today because of histories of marrying into surrounding tribes and because music is shared between communities. But there's no official structure for Kanamahu as a named tribe and people the way there is for, say, Karuk. So essentially there are power dynamics involved where contemporary tribes misalign with named communities that predate the formation of current political units. Right now, I'm primarily hesitant to name the community in this presentation because of privacy concerns and the power involved in naming. And I recognize that whatever I call us, whatever I say might set a precedent, and it's not something that we've yet really had a chance to discuss among each other. And so I would worry about the misuse of information out there before we're really able to set the protocol we need in place in terms of how to actually collaborate with us as stakeholders. Also important context for this project is that these recordings were created when, as part of sort of early anthropological pursuits of salvage ethnography, which describes when the field of anthropology and related fields like ethnomusicology went out into Indian communities with intents to quote unquote save dying cultures. The documentation and rhetoric that came out of salvage ethnography solidified in the public the fantasy that not only are Indigenous peoples disappearing, incapable of and not allowed to change from a supposedly pure state of being, but that if we do not match today what was documented about us by non-natives, then we are no longer quote unquote authentic. And this is heavily critiqued by Indigenous peoples. This binary that we are often put into of authentic and inauthentic is based on criteria that is colonially imposed based on stereotypes, and ignores that elimination was literally a goal of settler colonialism, and de-authenticating people is one means of elimination beyond actual genocide. It's cultural genocide. So it is largely, though not exclusively, from salvage ethnography that the binaries which kind of plague the dominant discourse on Indian people comes. These include noble and ignoble savagery, traditional and non-traditional, pure and impure, authentic and inauthentic, and so on. And this is already, unfortunately, present in the dominant discourse on Kanamahu. For instance, an article by Lars J. Larson from 1987 explicitly past tenses Kanamahu people within the title of the piece, which is "Who Were the Kanamahu?" And it's past tensing practices like this which aid in the goals of settler colonialism, which include the disappearance of Indigenous peoples. So within the dominant discourse on Indian people, anything that represents Indigenous peoples in the present tense is really deemed inauthentic, because our authenticity is assumed to exist in the past in the frozen records of salvage ethnography. And that brand of authenticity, that belief that what we do today has to exactly replicate what was documented about us in the past, really threatens the potential of projects like this, because again, it comes from outside of the community, whereas we should be the ones really deciding what constitutes legitimacy for our own people. So that's all to say, this project is in no way about reaching for some quote unquote pure state of the past, but instead about centering Native people and decentering the settler gaze, which imposes certain ways of understanding Native people and of judging and defining who we are, as well as kind of assuming the right to do so. It's also about honoring the work that our ancestors did. Grandma Ellen worked with people who very likely represented the end of her world as she knew it in order to create these recordings. And because of that, we have a great responsibility to her and to those who taught her. It's about protecting our intellectual property rights, and our rights as Indian people to our own creativity and to construct our own narratives. Many of the songs that Grandma Ellen sang and shared in these recordings are sacred in nature, so there is a lot of need for specific protocol and attentiveness to detail in this project and guidance from elders. So this summer, I began the initial community sharing of the project to gauge interest and see where my position as a researcher could best serve community goals. So I organized just a few initial meetings to talk to folks and get feedback, and also to listen to the recordings with family. You know, sometimes some songs are meant to be heard only by certain people and not by others. And so I didn't want to accidentally listen to something I wasn't supposed to hear. So I actually had just been waiting with the recordings, because also it meant more for me to not be alone while listening. I didn't want to listen alone. I wanted to listen with family. But due to the pandemic, our main meeting was virtual on Zoom. The way I did this was, I guess, snowball effect, I believe that's what it's called, where I invited folks who I knew were descendants of Grandma Ellen and asked them to please invite somebody they knew from the family. And I started small because these are the early grassroots, and I was advised to start small and to see how the project develops, because if it turns out that the recordings are meant to be heard by the community at large, then that can always happen later. However, if we start by sharing them broadly now and they turn out to be meant for a smaller group, then there's little means of kind of recalling what's already been done. And so that's what informed my methods and approach to this summer gathering. So the results of that meeting are, those who are involved right now are very excited about the possibilities for this and very happy that this is happening. There is interest in creating a board of representatives to make decisions about the use and sharing of the recordings, and making a clear path of communication with the archives in order to just have us be involved and have a say in what goes on with the recordings, as well as the notes, the metadata that go with the recordings. There's also interest in creating a secure online access portal that could function as, possibly function also as like a contemporary community archive. So those are just some of the objectives that were identified at these early stages. So reflections on the project. I found this experience extremely helpful. My background is mostly with Karuk language reclamation, and while I was kind of conceptualizing this project, one of my language teachers let me know that, hey, there's a need in our tribe for someone to have the experience of creating protocol for use and sharing for Karuk language recordings. So this project you're doing with your family could potentially be useful for that. So it's like I see through this work that there can be sort of a domino effect that community partnerships can take, and how following the research and responding to community interests can strengthen the tools of interconnected communities and expand possibilities for what we can do in the future and in the world as a whole. Another reflection I want to share is that while this project addresses colonial histories, it's also strengthening family ties and is generative of stories of survivance. So many descendants and lines in my family have differing types of experiences with colonization. So some family lines had already known about these recordings, and some didn't. Some folks shared stories of listening to the recordings because their families had copies of them, but they're not sure where those physical copies have ended up since their childhoods. So with the support of Mellon, I was able to get more copies made and given back to those involved. But with the memories people were having, I just think that there's something to be said for bringing these recordings, and I mean the physical recordings with grandma's voice, because some of the songs are still sung, but bringing those recordings back to people almost brings them back into context, like she's a relation. I mean, it's really something to be able to hear your great-great-great-grandmother's voice. That's a really beautiful thing, even kind of within the context of salvage ethnography. And this relates back to how these recordings kind of stir up stories and memories for different family members. People remember specific interactions with loved ones. So I think I'm struggling to make my point. My point is that one thing I am appreciating is how public research is able to remain in context. One more final reflection I'll share about this experience from the summer is that I see place and space as really vital to this work and to the public more broadly. In addition to some folks having had copies of these recordings in their childhoods, there was also some discussion of hearing karuk in the songs, or of interpreting the songs as karuk. And I think this is really neat and interesting for like reading through or reading beyond the archives, beyond the Western ways of categorizing our communities. The archives have these songs organized based on what they claim the quote-unquote informant identified themselves as. And so we would expect that Grandma Ellen identified herself as Kanamahu and from a particular village. She's from Wapsakachtea. And indeed, there's research showing how music moves through communities quite quickly as a way of unifying, and how music is shared across place. And so I think this observation that my family had could really tell us a lot about the ways music may not be attached to contemporary tribal formations in a very strict sense. And what the archives may say are Kanamahu could be Karuk and Kanamahu, because they belong to both communities at the times they were recorded. And they clearly belong to many families from various communities as those communities are named and organized today. So my reflection is more, I guess, about potential future research questions that I'm interested in pursuing about inter-tribal and inter-village connections through music, and how that interacts with sovereignty and community identity, and what that means for understanding how identity is constructed when historical identities might not necessarily align with contemporary, broader named tribes. But my next steps are, well, what was determined at the main meeting over the summer is that I am to create a family tree to share with people, so that we can make sure that anybody who is interested in being involved can reach out and start participating in meetings. I'm also to make connections with the Library of Congress much more defined, and just sort of figure out what the library's plans are and how we can be involved as stakeholders. In conclusion, this project was really about taking the first steps in order to figure out what direction I should take as a researcher and make sure it's supported by the community and just get these things going. And those first steps are really very important and at some point need to be done. My aims going in were to hopefully have the research questions, methods, and goals come from the community rather than just myself. And so the future project is very much applied, which essentially means there are research objectives which will be guided by research questions, but those questions will more likely have to do with the processes which lead to the community identified outcomes. For instance, what kind of portals would best suit our needs, and how should we determine that? And again, my hope is that this will contribute to the public's toolkit for addressing colonial histories in California and working with California communities, and also join the larger discussions about Native research methodologies, because our project, I hope, can act as sort of a guide for communities interested in doing similar things, where they can adjust it for their specific local needs. Okay, I'm really grateful to have had this project supported by the Mellon Foundation and to have had the opportunity and experience of being a Mellon Public Scholar over the summer of 2021. This program helped me design and implement this project and make community work possible. And so I have the Mellon Foundation and everyone involved to thank for that, including coordinators and instructors, Stephanie and Erica, and my faculty advisor, Jessica Psett-Perea. I have all of these people to thank for that. I also feel very grounded and guided by my own family and broader community, and I wouldn't feel right about pursuing this work if that weren't the case. And so it makes me feel grateful to them and their support and their participation over the summer. I take responsibility for all of my interpretations in this project, and any mistakes or misinterpretations are my own, and I'm willing to learn from that as we move forward. Yav im tanek yav, nani araras karu nani exupansas yotoa suvanek.